I take my child to the playground and every single other child at the playground is speaking a foreign language to their parent. My child is the only child at the playground that's speaking English. And I'm surrounded by people that are being told, oh, this is a great multicultural diversity, and it just means less white people, less white culture, and ultimately we're going to turn into global South Africa. And I will fight to stop that from happening. I had family in South Africa. I'm not letting it happen here. And so I'm trying with all my might to be peaceful and reasonable and political, but we have to protect white Australia. We have to.
A lot of racism in white families occurs behind closed doors.
Racism is caused by various things.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today we are diving into a powerful and trending conversation that has been blowing up across TikTok and is one we need to be talking about. In a video that is approaching 1 million views, creators are speaking out against the rising undercurrent of racial anxiety, prejudice and nationalism that is often hidden behind the veil of cultural preservation. What starts as a parent complaint about their child being the only English speaker at a diverse playground quickly unravels into a much deeper and much darker narrative about race, privilege, and the fear of losing cultural dominances. But this isn't just about calling out racism, it's about how white allies like Kylie are stepping up, using their voices to challenge the normalized behind closed doors racism embedded in families and communities. It's about understanding where ignorance stems from and how education, empathy, and honest conversations can begin to break the circle. We are unpacking all of it. TikTok creators from all walks of life, some sharing life experience, others urging people to go back to where they are from, and many courageously calling out hypocrisy, historically analysis, and gaslighting. These clips are raw, uncomfortable, and necessary. If you are here for real talk, unfiltered perspectives, and the kind of content that pushes us to think deeper and grow together, then stick around. Let's get into it.
Literally don't know where to start. There's so many things to destroy in this argument. Oh my gosh, boo-hoo. Oh, your child's the only person who speaks a different language from all the other people around them. Sounds insensitive to say it like that, right? You can't be like, oh, Australia has to be literally just all white and I don't like it that my child goes to the playground and no one speaks the same language. No, you know what? Instead of upgrading and being more inclusive and understanding, hey, this is my culture, this is your culture, let's come together. No. How about your culture just leaves, okay? So everyone looks and sounds like me. Because I don't want it to look like South Africa. That's what he said. Keep in mind the apartheid and all that other stuff that happened. It's almost like it was the black people's land. And then the white dudes went over there and did their thing and took it over. Nelson Mandela and all that stuff happened. And then he's saying, I don't want it to be like that. He's basically inferring that the South Africans had land, they had power, and then they lost it to the blacks. Even though it was their land to begin with. Ironic that it's sort of like the same mindset that he has with Australia. It was indigenous peoples, and then the white people got it, occupied it, and now he's angry that it's becoming diverse and multicultural, which is not even to the degree he's saying. Look, everyone should live in harmony. Some places have more white people, some places have more black people, okay? It's okay to have different cultures. We're not trying to take it from you. And if we were, rightfully so, you couldn't even be mad because you took it from someone else. Or goes around, comes back around, or karma. Not that I believe in karma, but you get what I'm saying. Imagine saying that. Oh, I'm going to walk little Timmy. Oh my gosh, no one's black around here. Oh, it's the government's fault. And you know what? Even though it's the government's fault, I actually hate it that everyone's speaking a different language than this language, okay? Our language is the best language. It's the superior one. And I don't like it that we don't have our own place. So all you other families who have come from hardship, all the other families come from hardship and have had a tough time migrating and assimilating, guess what? I actually don't think you belong here, even though this is pretty much stolen land. And you know what? I feel unfairly done. Yes, it was taken from you, but I want my people to have it. Talk about the irrational mindset.
My name's Kylie, and I'm obviously white. I grew up in a conservative white family, and I know there's been a lot of discourse about whether white people should talk about racism, and here's my argument for why I think that not only should we, but we have to. A lot of racism in white families occurs behind closed doors. I've been over at friends' parents' places and heard them say some pretty obscene things about people of color, assuming that I am on their side simply because I am white. Obviously, this makes for some awkward conversations when I do call them out, but point being, the depths of the racism and the darkness that seeps in deeply into these families can only, in my opinion, truly be exposed by other white people, because they will never be their full racist selves around anyone who is not white. They like to save face publicly and say that they're not racist, but then again, if you go into their homes and you hear the things they say, that would suggest otherwise. I just encourage you, if you're a white person and you know people like this, please say something. Don't just ignore it for fear of conflict.
Why doesn't he just go back to England? Yeah. Just go back to where you're from. See how insensitive that feels? To hear someone say, hey, you're not welcome here, go back. This is what this comment response said in response to a video which is basically about to hit 1 million views and got like over 64,000 messages and likes and all that type of good stuff. Go back to England. This comment is basically saying, you're saying all this stuff to immigrants, you're basically saying you're not welcome in Australia, you're a second-class citizen, so go back to where you're actually from. And you know what? Saying that to a person who is Caucasian or has white descent, you know, basically a white person, it would seem rude of me to say that. So I wouldn't really want to go up to someone and say that. But it seems like not all white people got to say that before anyone gets upset, but it seems like certain people who live in this country, or any country for that matter, have the right or the boldness or the superiority complex in their head to basically say, go back to where you're from, when they're not really from there. Next time you tell someone to go back to where they're from, make sure you're ready to go back to where you're from, okay? Now, people might be like, why is this guy just bringing up all this old stuff? Stop telling people to go back to where they're from. It's a disrespectful, undermining, and basically pointing the finger and saying you're a second-class citizen and I have the right to tell you where to go because you're not like me and you don't have the rights and the status. But at the end of the day, maybe you don't have the moral rights and the status. You might have it technically, but you don't have it morally and ethically. So instead of telling people to go back to where they're from, how about we try to be more understanding and inclusive, and we have a situation where everyone can live together, instead of you coming out of fear and being like, all right, this is mine, I'm losing it. Everyone doesn't look like me anymore. You know what? There's a fear in me. Let me get all the white people together and tell all of them to tell every immigrant and anyone who doesn't look like me to go back to where you're from. Of course, the immigrant or the indigenous or the person is going to be like, whoa. If you want to play it like that, let's look at the layout properly. You're not really from here. So morally and ethically, you should go back. If you want to start talking about everyone should go back to where you're actually from, then technically you're not from here. Unless you're going to add, well, I can stay here because I have enough power and I took it and I cheated to get it, then that would be another case. You know what I'm saying? I would get in trouble, and rightfully so, if I was to go up to a white Australian or go up to someone who's complaining about immigrants or whatever and just be like, go back to where you're from. Even though that would make more sense that I'm calling out them after they've told me to go back for where I'm from, go back to Africa or go back to America. And then I say, no, you go back to where you're from. That would make more sense because I'm using their logic against them, right? Well, if I'm not from here, I'll go back, but you're not from here, so you should go back as well. But they would be like, nah, that doesn't count. Reset the game starts again. You can't choose sides of fairness when it benefits you. Or we can live together and we can make the best of what we have right here and we can start moving along. I think it was a great point that this commenter said. Basically, go back to where you're from. You're talking all this rah-rah, talking all this rubbish that this is mine, this is this and that, and South Africa had its problems, and I have family over in South Africa. But at the end of the day, you're telling someone to go back to where they're from, and you're not even from there.
Hi everyone, it's nice to see you. Thanks for stopping by. Thank you, Kylie, for being able to articulate it in a way that I haven't been able to up to this point. And thank you for having the courage to say it so that I can join my voice to yours and others will hear this. Because you've said it plainly, simply, and honestly and truthfully. If this didn't happen in your home, it happened in your neighbor's home. And it happened in your church. And it happened on your school board. Yep. and it's happened in your state house, and it is the exact reason why the Heritage Foundation can even exist. Because this has always been the language in closed spaces behind closed doors. And there's no denying it anymore. Go back and listen to Kylie one time, all the way through. And listen, right? Don't counter any of the points that she's saying. Consume what she's saying. Listen to her one time. And it might be able to bring you to a place to understand that when I say, hearing this man is patriotic, and the discomfort that comes from hearing this man is necessary to address the truth and resolve, find resolution and solutions. Patriotic duty for the sake of the nation, because our nation is gasping for breath under the very heel of what Kylie is saying and what I know as factual truth through lived and observed experience. And there's no gaslighting that. Listen to her one time through. Don't say but one single time. Just listen all the way through. And tell me that you don't know that as the truth in the country that we have all lived in for all of this time. For our nation. For our healing. For our future. For our children. Jesus Christ. Try something new, right? Try something new. Love you. I hope you're safe. Protect each other. I'll see you next time.
Racism is caused by various things. Lack of exposure to people from other ethnic groups, lack of education, radicalization, lack of intelligence, negative experiences with people of a specific ethnic group. Those are just some of the factors. And it's something that you will find across the world regardless of skin colour. I firmly reject the argument that only white people can be racist and that racism only exists when there's a power imbalance involved. We've just got to be mindful of the fact that as white people living in the West, the main form of racism that we see with the most significant power imbalance is white to black, white to Asian, etc. And I also want to say this, when you're listening to people talking about racial matters on TikTok, question what they're saying, keep an open mind and be cautious with it, including with my own. Because on TikTok, there are some particularly radical voices from both sides. You've got the white racist 4chan neo-colonialist types, but then you've also got these supposed racial equality advocates who are actually racist themselves. These people that claim all white people are inherently sinful and responsible for the history of their ancestors. But that aside, I'm going to talk about my personal experiences of where racism stems from. So if you don't watch my stuff already, bit of context, I grew up in Devon. It's a very white area. In my school of 1,600 people, there were probably just under 10 people that weren't white. It was the sort of town where if someone was black, they would be referred to as black, followed by their name, because that would be the quickest way for anyone to know who they are, because they would be one of the only black people in that place. I also spent some time in very rural parts of Australia, which is a country that has a reputation for racism. But I've also lived in very diverse cities such as London and Melbourne, and I now live in the most diverse part of Leeds, in a majority black and Asian area. In my experience, the primary causes of racism come from a lack of exposure, a lack of awareness, and a lack of education. And I'll give you an example of this. Last time I went down to Devon, I was chatting to a white bloke in the pub. We were chatting about football, and in particular, we were chatting about Pierre-Emerick Aubameyang, an African player. Now, this guy was talking about Aubameyang being money greedy. But instead of focusing on the fact that he was money greedy, he described Aubameyang as a dirty little African. So I questioned him on that. Why would you say that? I asked him, have you actually met many African people? Obviously, Africa is an enormous continent with divergent peoples and cultures, but in the context of this conversation, referring to Central Africa. And unsurprisingly, the bloke said no. And it turned out the reason that he thought that way is because he had a preconception, a racial stereotype of Africans all being poor and thus being greedy, that they would do anything to escape from poverty, which is a racist stereotype. It's a horrible opinion. I'm sure many people would hear this and they would be appalled by it. I personally find it a disgusting opinion as well. But the thing is, sometimes you have to understand where that stems from so that you can address that. Because there are different approaches in how you can handle it. You can come down on things harshly with the zero tolerance approach, which I do think is necessary a lot of the time. But it is also important to understand where it stems from in the first place so that you can stop it happening in the first place. Proactive rather than reactive responses. And this example is just one of many examples I could give of where the opinion stems from ignorance and a lack of education, a lack of exposure to people from different groups. Because the average person that's grown up in London wouldn't dare to say something like that, because they would have been exposed to diversity. They will know people of various different ethnicities and they will be able to see that actually we're all human. But for some people, if they've grown up in a majority white area and they have been exposed to racist stereotypes from a very young age, that is going to shape the way that they think. Particularly if this is the sort of stuff that they hear a lot as a child when they're going through their formative years. And that's why the education point is so important, because there isn't going to be diversity everywhere in the country. On a slightly pessimistic note, I sadly think that racism probably is one of those things that will always exist. But I'm optimistic that we can educate people over time to become more aware and more tolerant. Because fundamentally, we are all humankind. And the more we understand each other, the more we can flourish as a species. Now, because of some of the stuff I've said in here, I wouldn't be surprised if this video gains traction with some of the least desirable people on TikTok, such as the ones I mentioned earlier. So if you do see comments and stitches of this video that are particularly radical, again, as I said, just be mindful that this is TikTok and that most people are actually open to more rational and sensible conversation. Don't get caught up with arguing in the comments.
What we are witnessing in that original playground complaint isn't just a moment of frustration. It's a deeply revealing snapshot of the psychology behind racial and cultural anxiety. A parent takes their child to a playground and notices every other child speaking a language different from English. Their response, not curiosity, not openness, but fear, anger, and resentment. This is not about the languages. It's about control. It's about comfort. It's about a perceived loss of dominancy. Let's call it what it is. This isn't about culture being erased. It's about white culture not being the default anymore, and that discomfort is being weaponized under the guise of patriotism and national identity. And the comparison to South Africa, that is not a random example, is loaded. It draws a line between historical white dominance and what the speaker fears is reversal of control. It frames multiculturalism not as a celebration of diversity, but as a threat to whiteness. And that right there is the heart of the issue. The idea that inclusion of others somehow means exclusion of oneself. This kind of historic isn't new, but is especially dangerous when cloaked in peaceful or reasonable language. Because let's be honest, when someone says I am trying to be political and peaceful, but then follows it up with we have to protest with Australia, what they are really saying is I don't want Australia to look or feel different from my idea of it. I don't want my child to grow up in a world where there hasn't the norm. And that is the uncomfortable part. This mindset doesn't acknowledge that Australia, like many Western nations, was never homogeneous to begin with. It was never white Australia in any moral or historical sense. Indigenous Australians were here tens of thousands of years before European settlers arrived. So when people say go back to where you came from, they are not just being offensive, they are being hypocritical. Because if that logic applied evenly, settling would be the first ones packing their bags. What makes this even more insidious is the entitlement that comes with this worldview. The assumption that speaking English in public spaces should be the default, that seeing different ethnic groups gathering together is a sign of national decline, that hearing another language at a playground is somehow a threat to a child's future. Now let's talk about Kelly's take, because it's powerful, necessary and sadly still real. Kelly, a white woman who grew up in a conservative white family, calls out the everyday racism that happens behind closed doors. She talks about the offhand remarks, the jokes, the assumptions made in private company, assumptions that are only shared because the speaker assumes the listener will agree because of their skin color. That is exactly why white voices like Kelly's are critical in this conversation, because racism often survives in shadows. It doesn't always wear hoods and scream slurs. It often whispers in dining rooms, in group chats, in holiday gatherings, and people of color doesn't always have access to those spaces, but white people do. And if they stay silent, they are complete. Another creator in the thread echoes this and takes it a step forward, reminding us that this kind of behind the scene racism doesn't just live in the homes. It lives in churches, in schools boards, in politics. It's how we get policy that exclude, structures that discriminate, and institutions that are remain unequal. And unless white allies are willing to speak up loudly and consistently, nothing changes. Racism adapts, it survives, it flourishes. Now, let's also a voice in the conversation warning viewers about extremism on both ends. That is important too, because this conversation doesn't end to turn into a purity test. There are racist ideologies on one end, and yes, there are rationally voices on the other that sometimes generalize or scapegoat in the name of justice. The key is to engage with nuisance, to question, to understand context, to challenge ideas, but do so with clarity, evidence, and a commitment to share humanity. And that is where education comes in. So many of the worst racial ideas come out not from deep hatred but from deep ignorance. When someone grows up in a mostly white area and never meets people from different backgrounds and hears stereotypes repeated for years, their view of the world becomes dangerously narrow. It's not an excuse but is an explanation, one that calls for proactive solutions. Diversity in education, media that represent everyone, community events that celebrate different culture, not just tolerates them. We need to remember racism is not always loud. Sometimes it's quiet, sometimes it's a sign, a side comment, a refusal to speak next to someone on a bus. Sometimes it's framing yourself as the victim of diversity when really you are just no longer the only voice in the room. And that is not oppression, that is equality, that is progress. The truth is, cultural evolution is happening whether some people like it or not. Australia, like the US, like the UK, is becoming more multilingual, more multi-ethnic, and more globally connected. You can either resist that and let it embitter you, or you can embrace it and let it enrich you. And to those who say go back to where you came from, think carefully about what that actually means. Because that phrase has never been about geography, it's about status, it's about exclusion, it's about telling someone that they don't belong based on how they look or speak or pray. And when you hear that phrase directed at you, it stings. But when you hear it coming from you, you should question what part of yourself feels so threatened by someone else simply existing. At the end of the day, this is a bigger than playgrounds. It's about who gets to belong, who gets to feel safe, who gets to defy a national identity. And if your vision of your country only includes people who look and sound like you, then it's time to ask yourself, is it really patriotism you are fighting for, or is it privilege? Thanks for watching. If this gave you something to think about, don't forget to like, comment and subscribe for more thoughtful breakdowns and honest conversations. Stay informed, stay passionate, and I will catch you in the next one.